You're listening to NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Faculty of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw. My name is Maria Usakowska. In 2016, Brazilian transgender activist and writer Amara Moira published her memoir titled What If I Was a Prostitute, in which she wrote about her experiences as a prostitute in the city of São Paulo and raised questions related to transphobia. Published in a country that statistically is considered one of the most transphobic in the world, the book gained a lot of recognition. It is also the central topic of today's conversation with Professor Luciana Namorato. Luciana Namorato is a professor of literature in Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University Bloomington in the United States. She graduated in literature from University of Rio de Janeiro and in journalism from PUC Rio. She holds a master's degree and a doctorate from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Coimbra. She currently directs the exchange program at Indiana University, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Tulane at the Complutense University in Madrid. Her research interests include contemporary Brazilian prose, the question of the autobiographical in literature, and the dialogues between Brazilian and Portuguese literature in the 19th century. In this episode, we focus on the issue of transphobia in Brazil and all over the world. We discuss the differences between autofiction and fictionalized autobiography and how trans activists are using this literary genre to express themselves. Professor Namorato explains terms such as transfeminism, recognized globally, and putafeminismo, which is specific to Brazil. I hope you find this episode interesting and educational. Please enjoy my conversation with Professor Namorato. Professor Luciana Namorato, welcome to NeoTalk.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
So I wanted to start by reading some statistics from a 2022 article called Brazil Continues to be the Country with the Largest Number of Trans People Killed. And in this article, it says that according to Transgender Europe 2021 report, which monitors data globally collected by trans and LGBTQIA plus institutions, 70% of all the murders recorded have happened in South and Central American countries, and 33% of them took place in Brazil. Then between 2020 and 2021, 375 murders were recorded in the world, which represents a 7% rise compared to the previous year. And another article from 2023 claims that the year before, in 2022, 131 trans people were murdered in the country. Unfortunately, another 20 took their own lives as a result of discrimination and prejudice. So these statistics are absolutely horrific. And what's particular, I think, is that Brazil seems to be an extraordinarily transphobic country compared to the rest of the world, statistically at least. And I read that although transphobia appears in Brazil's legislation as a crime since 2019, the country doesn't collect much data on LGBT crimes. So could you talk a little bit about why do you think that is? Why specifically in Brazil, on one side, trans people are somehow invisible, but then also they're extra visible when it comes to being victims of crime?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. I think it's one more example of the fact that Brazil is a country full of contradictions. For many, many years, we received, I think, the highest number of African slaves in the whole world. And until very recently, Brazil was considered by Brazilians and foreigners a racial democracy, which we know it's not true. So I think the situation of transgender people and queer people in Brazil is very similar to the African Brazilians. On the one hand, you have this idea that Brazil is a great country, there's no racism, everybody loves everybody. And if you go to the media, the artists are Black artists. We have soccer player Pelé, we have the Brazilian singer Gilberto Gil. So the world knows Brazil for its Black people. The world knows Brazil for its transgender people and its queer people. So nowadays, for example, we have Valentina Sampaio, who is a model for Victoria's Secret. She's the first transgender model She's one of the angels of Victoria's Secret, and she's a transgender woman from Brazil. Then you see Linda Quebrada, who is a singer, actress, and she's known worldwide. You know Pablo Vittar, he's a queer. He's not a transgender person, but he's a queer. It's someone who dresses as a woman, but who considers himself as a man. He's very well known. But then you look at the statistics, and Brazil is the country that kills the most transgender people in the whole world for the 15th year. So there's data collected, there's awareness, there's a lot of non-governmental institutions and institutions from the government who are very aware of this. For example, the public defender's offices of the main states, the most important states in Brazil, Rio, São Paulo, they have a center dedicated to defending transgender people. And it's very effective, but unfortunately, the crimes are still happening. So I like to say that it is a country of contradictions, and that's the only way we can explain such paradox.
So you don't think it's somehow connected to, for example, some sort of machismo culture as we have that exists in South American countries?
I think yes. I think it is connected to that. It is connected again to this ambiguity, to this paradox of men seeking, for example, transgender prostitutes, but at the same time not coming to terms with their own choices, right? And it's not only that Brazil exports artists, Brazil also exports transgender prostitutes. If you look in an Italian dictionary since the late 80s, they have the word viado, which is used for gay people, gay male, gay man in Brazil. It has been added to the main Italian dictionary as a word to refer to transgender prostitutes working in Italy. So we're exporting culture produced by transgender individuals. We're exporting sex offered by those individuals. But in the country, we're doing the same thing. But then you have a reaction from the conservative part of the population. But also, for sure, the machismo is... It explains a lot of it, but also this idea that Brazil wants to be something that it's not. You know what I mean? It wants to be a very conservative country when it actually is a very open country in some terms.
You specialize in literature written by transgender men and women in Brazil. Could you maybe give us a quick detour of the history of this genre, if we can even call it a genre?
So first of all, I have to say, I am not a specialist on this area of literature. I work as a professor of Brazilian literature and Portuguese literature in the U.S., and part of my job is actually to be a specialist on everything. But I can tell you a little bit about how I got to this topic. So the first course I taught at Indiana University, where I'm working now, was about the other in Brazilian literature. So I'm very much interested in the literature that is inclusive, because I always remember a quote by Milan Kundera. He says in the work, The Art of the Novel, he says, the novel is the territory where everyone has the right to be understood. And I like that, because you don't have to agree with a character, but you can understand the motivations of an antagonist, of someone who does something that you don't really condone. So, for example, I've been working on literature written by foreigners or about foreigners in Brazil, women's literature, Black literature written by Black writers in Brazil. I've done a little bit on the representation of diseases in literature. And when now recently this book by Amara Moira came to my attention, I became sort of fascinated by this, let's say, field, right? Because I don't think we could call it a genre. But if you really think about it, transgender people have always existed. You have all the narratives, for example, of monks in Spain, or nuns who later they found out they were transgender. You know, having the habit was a way of hiding their bodies, but also any sort of reproductive sexual life. So went into a religious life, they didn't have to talk about their body, their decisions. And sometimes when they went to bury those bodies, they were not the bodies they were expecting. They thought they were going to bury a male monk, and it was a woman. And when you think about in terms of writings by transgender people, I think the first records might be from the late 19th century. There is a book by a German, I think he was a psychologist or a psychiatrist maybe, and he includes in his book, of course, he was treating transgender issues as pathologies. So he includes in his book an account, autobiographical account of a transgender individual. That might be one of the first records of a manifestation of a text by a transgender individual. When you think about Brazil, Amara Moira herself, the writer I'm studying, she is collecting data on writings by transgender people. And the problem is those writings have been published by small publishing houses. They have been forgotten somehow. So I think the most well-known accounts we have, which are by no means well-known in mainstream Brazil or literature, are from the late 80s, from the 80s. And they're by transgender men. So the first one that I had read was called A Queda para o Alto, Descending Upwards. The title is very interesting too, right? Descending upwards. It shows the contradiction in those bodies. And it is a person who was born a woman, who presented himself as a man, but he pretty much talks a lot about his troubles in a prison for young offenders in Brazil called FEBEM. Of course, the treatment was horrible to any child being imprisoned there, but of course his experience was different because he was a transgender young man, right? And it's interesting because that book has for years been treated as an account of that violence in a prison for young prisoners. It hasn't been read too much as an account by a transgender person. That has been done more recently. And the other titles from the 80s are also from male transgender individuals. And I love the titles again, A Mistaken Identity, right? So it's all about this way of trying to understand oneself, which in my opinion is fascinating. And of course now we get more recently to the more recent years, and we see more and more accounts, thanks also to the existence of blogs. The media has helped a lot because people have more channels to express themselves, to debate the construction of their identity, which they didn't have in the past.
And now we even have social media, right? And YouTube is such for me personally, it's also a source of information, on transgender identities as well. Apart from the fact that these novels that you're talking about and books are written by trans men and women, can we talk about some common characteristics of these works, both in form and its contents?
So you're going to see a lot of the writings of the self, of course, right? Because we're talking about the self for a reason here. It's not just a plain interest in oneself and egocentrism, nothing like that, but we're actually building identities, right? Discussing identities. So we're going to see memoirs. We're going to see accounts of traumas, of challenges. We're going to see a lot of diary type of writings, letter type of writings, a lot of thinking about the past and the present. So in terms of form, we see more prose than poetry. And I think it is because it has to do with this nature of something being urgent, right? And having to be expressed more clearly, debated more clearly. So I think those would be the main characteristics. We have a language that's more informal because it's more like a day-to-day way of discussing these issues and narrating their experiences.
You mentioned that these authors, write about themselves, right? And when I was preparing, I read about this author that you're studying, that she's using either autobiography or fictionalized autobiography or what we call autofiction. Could you maybe explain the subtle differences of these genres, or are there any?
So, first of all, the biography and the autobiography are easier to explain, right? It is a text that you write about yourself, autobiography, or about someone else, and you claim that it's the truth. I mean, of course, we know the truth, written truth, is not the same as the experienced truth, but there is a claim that that's real. That's the reality. The question of autofiction is a little more complicated. It's a term that appeared in the late 70s. It was kind of proposed in a novel by Serge Dubrovsky called Fils. And the idea is that in the autofiction, you have an author who the narrator and the character share the last name as the author, right? But the author claims that the book is not true. Right? Mm-hmm. It's a fictional book. So somehow it's this strange thing that is a fiction, but it has the name of the author as the character, and it narrates things that pertain to the life of that writer. So the term autofiction has been studied exhaustively for the past 50 years, and there is really no agreement. For some critics, it was kind of a response to the way autobiographies were understood, not as literary enough. So it was a way for someone to write an autobiography and still say, I'm writing literature, For some people, it was a way of bringing into discussion the idea that anything that's written is modified. Even the arrangement of the facts already makes something fiction, right? But when we think about, for example, the book by Amara Moira, she does not claim that it's an autofiction. It is sort of her memoirs, so it is more like an autobiography. But recently in the Brazilian book fair in Paraty, was the main book fair in Brazil, she was in a roundtable about autofiction. So it is interesting. She is also present in those discussions. But one thing I want to say is nowadays there is sort of an exhaustion of autofictions, right? Autofictions are everywhere. Writers writing fiction, but putting their lives there, their names there. And in my humble opinion, when we have a very high number of, let's say, white cisgender men writing autofiction that focus solely on their individual lives, their difficulties finishing their books, which in my opinion is kind of boring. But when we look at autofictions or autobiographies that deal with a population that's more marginalized, in my opinion, it becomes very interesting, because learning about the life of a transgender prostitution is not something that, unfortunately, I don't come in contact with. Because if you think about the percentage of the transgender population in my social circles, it's very low. So it's not that I have a friend who's going to tell me what happened. So it is a very good way of learning what's going on with those people. And that's also true for the literature written about the slums. Probably most people have seen the movie City of God, which was based on a book. And of course, it is sort of an autobiographical account by Paulo Lins of his experiences as a child and a young man in one of those communities, right? And that's another way when I think the autobiographical, the autofiction has a very, very important role in literature.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think one of the most impactful books for me were those that were written by authors of, let's say, a different ethnicity, or people who experienced racism, let's say, or homophobia, right? And they just describe their experience. And in that way, I think literature can basically just create more empathy, in its readers. And when researching this topic, there was also the term transfeminism that appeared, which I think it's pretty important here. So before discussing literature more deeply, maybe could you explain this notion?
Yes. I think that's the question that actually a lot of people ask me when I propose to talk about this topic. And I can even talk about transfeminism together with horror feminism, because I think it's easier to explain them together. The idea for the trans feminists, of course, you're seeing that it is an addition or a modification of the word feminism. It is a claim that the feminism, as the way we understand, or some people understand, is not enough, and it's not inclusive enough. So when you think about transfeminism, what happens is it's a way of understanding trans misogyny as an effect of patriarchy also. In other words, it's saying, if you're a woman claiming you're a feminist, but you are making claims against transgender people and their right to claim their womanness, you are somehow following the patriarchy, right? So trans feminists who claim to be trans feminists, they view gender conformity as a form of control mechanism of patriarchy, right? You're kind of being compliant with patriarchy if you do not recognize the right of a transgender individual to be a woman also and to join the fight for feminism. And it's interesting because the first two waves of feminism, of course, did not include transgender people. But when you go to the 90s, for the third wave, and now the most recently for the last 10 years, we see this impulse towards trans liberation as part of women's liberation movement. Of course, you're always going to have a group of more conservative feminists who will only see, for example, who will only see this as a way of trying to weaken the feminist movement, but there is a large group that's more inclusive. So when you go to horror feminism, which in Portuguese would be putafeminismo, right? That's a similar way of thinking about these issues. It's a way of thinking feminism through intersectionality, right? It's a way of understanding our reactions to sex workers, our negative reactions to sex workers, as a form of control mechanism of patriarchy. So it's a way of keeping sex sort of pure, right? And of saying there are different levels of sex, and this is good and this is bad. So for both cases, what we're trying to say is to continue understands the mechanism of oppression that we're living through, even though sometimes we say we're trying to save someone from a situation of prostitution, when the prostitutes themselves are saying this is a choice and this is a way of also freeing the concept of sex from the way we have understood it in a conservative way, let's say.
I want to ask you about the specific author that you've already mentioned, Amara Moira,
yes.
Who is a transgender prostitute writer and activist. She also earned a PhD in theory of literature at the University of Campinas. She was the author of the blog that was called What If I Was a Prostitute, which was later published as the book under the same title. She seems like a very eclectic figure. How would you describe her work, and what are the most important qualities of it?
I think the aspect that most called my attention is that when Amara decided to present herself as a woman, it all came together. It happened at the same time. She became a transgender woman, prostitute, and writer, all at the same time. She cannot dissociate those three things in her experience. So her book is based on her blog. Her blog was written between 2014 and 16. The first edition of the book was published in 2015. It's kind of a sentence that is a suggestion. What if I were a prostitute, right? And the interesting thing about this book is its second edition that was published in 2018. The publication of the second edition already met with a different Brazil, a more conservative Brazil with a more conservative president. So she had to publish the second edition under a different title. She made a change from puta, which means prostitute, to pura, which means pure. So the book cover has an R written over the T. And then more recently, she has a new edition from 2023 that goes back to the title puta, prostitute, but it has a little flip, so you can see pura under puta. And I think it's a very clever way of presenting the book cover, because the whole book is about this game of opposites, right? Being a man and a woman, being pure and being a prostitute. And the title of the book is explained by her in the book. She says, my biggest fear in the whole world was to become a prostitute. And that's what kind of hindered her decision to present herself, to transition into being a woman. And the moment she decided to transition, she also decided to face her biggest fear. And I find it amazing the way she explains how she feels inside the world of prostitution. She was a PhD student at Unicamp, the University of Campinas, as you mentioned. And she explains that at the university in Campinas, there are 30,000 students. And when she joined the PhD program, there were only 10 transgender individuals. That's 0.03% of the population. When she joined this street in Campinas called Jardim Itatinga, that's the prostitution street. She says there were 2,000 prostitutes, out of which 100 were transgender. That's 5% of the population. She said, for the first time, I looked around and I saw people like me. She also says that, can you imagine if 5% of a university body of students were transgender? That means you would have a transgender individual in your class, but people unfortunately go through life without having any friend. So they are still, she says that in the book, we're this weird animal for many people. And it is true. Recently, I was driving in an Uber on the streets of Madrid and in the Chueca neighborhood, which the neighborhood of the LGBTQ plus neighborhood in Madrid. And there was a woman walking, and the driver said, look at this person, kind of throwing on our faces her way of life. In other words, being a transgender person, the way these people present themselves is an offense to people. They are seen as animals, like, let's look at this person. And besides being so strange, this person is forcing this upon me. So that's one of the reasons that Amara uses to justify her interest in prostitution. I have to add that's very interesting because her book doesn't give us an answer. It doesn't tell us I became a prostitute because I desperately needed money, because I found myself, because I love. There are different ways of explaining it. One of them is, she says, I like sex, why not get paid for it? But it is quite hard to pinpoint her own explanation, her own definition of why she joined prostitution.
As I read, Moira writes in Pajuba, the language adopted by the LGBT population in Brazil. Could you talk about the history of this language and what are its characteristics, and maybe why also Moira chose to use it?
So when you think about the content and form of Moira's work, it's kind of impossible to dissociate them. So when you go to the content, you have the narration of her experiences, a lot of humor, a lot of back and forth. And then when you look at the language, most chapters, which are not exactly chapters, right? They're the daily, it would be more like a diary entry, right? They are populated with different words for us who are not members of this community. And of course, later she talks about it. And what she does is she uses Pajubá, which is also sometimes read as Bajubá. And this is a dialect of Brazilian Portuguese that's spoken by the LGBT community and the transgender community in Brazil. And it has a very interesting history. Pajubá has a lot of vocabulary, a lot of words that come from African languages spoken in Brazil, mostly the Yoruba, from the Yoruba region. Why? Because this language, this dialect started in the 70s, and we're thinking about a Brazil under dictatorship. And the space where the LGBT population was well accepted was within these African Brazilian religions, right? For example, Candomblé, Umbanda. So that's why this language is so full of those words, because it comes from the presence of an LGBT community in those religious practices. So the language is nowadays widespread, and it's, of course, not only used by transgender individuals, but also by gay individuals too. And it's a very rich area of research for linguists, which is not my specialty, of course. But it's a language that's very alive on the streets, in the homes, in soap operas, in songs. So, for example, one of the title of Linda Quebrada's album is Pajubá, because it is alive in the life of the transgender people. And every now and then it appears in a soap opera, and then it becomes more and more widespread. There was a question about Pajubá that appeared, I think, in 2018 in the national exams in Brazil, the exams for the students before they enter the university. And it caused a little bit of backlash from the conservative president and population. But it was a very interesting question, because we even have dictionaries of Pajubá. The most important one is called Aurélia, because the main dictionary in Brazil for decades is Aurélio, written by Aurélio Buarque de Holanda. And one characteristic of the Pajubá is to put the words in the feminine and kind of change words that don't change masculine to feminine. So our dictionary of Pajubá is Aurélia.
I think when it comes to trans lives in Brazil, we also have to remember the importance of intersectionality, right? Recognizing that transgender experiences are shaped by multiple factors such as race, ethnicity, class, ability. Do you think intersectionality plays a role in Amara Moira's work?
Yes, it does, because I think in some passages of her book, she's very much aware of her privileges. And she never tells her clients, for example, that she was a PhD student. She knows that would kind of mess with her work, right? But in some moments, she's very much aware, and it shows, for example, the client's appreciation for the white body, because she has a white body, right? It shows that an awareness that her experience is not representative of all transgender prostitutes. We have many scenes, many passages of violence in her book, but there's also an awareness that's not the worst that happens. There are people who have it much worse. So on the one hand, there is a very clear explanation that transgender prostitutes are actually in a worse condition than non-transgender prostitutes. They charge much less, they get paid much less, they have to work on the streets, they have to go into little corners to perform their work. But on the other hand, there is an awareness by Amara Moira that her situation not the worst. There are people in much worse situations if they're Black, if they come from lower, less privileged classes too. Mm-hmm. And she even talked about fat bodies in her book. That's one interesting thing when you think about the transition from the blog to the book, because when she published the blog, I had not read when she published the blog, but there were some passages where she talks about fat bodies of clients. And she was very much criticized in the blog for that as being fat phobia. So when she published the book in the book form, she made some changes. She also talks about it in the book. I have thought about it. Yes, I have made some mistakes when describing bodies and dealing with bodies. So intersectionality plays a very important role here.
I think a message that oftentimes appears in the background of these books or stories is, first, it's resilience, because as I understand, trans experience oftentimes requires a lot of resilience, right? Just to exist, basically, on a daily basis. But second, there is a call for action as well. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think cisgender people who want to be allies can do to support trans rights?
So there's some very strong scenes in the book in which Amara, for example, describes herself walking on the streets and the way people look at her. I think that stayed with me because what she's pretty much saying is the very fact of taking a few steps in public with the body that she chose to have, with the way she decided and chose to present herself, is already a challenge. Things we take for granted, we're accepted into circles because we fit in a certain way. So I think cisgender people, for me, what they can do, what the book called them to do, is to get to know those other experiences, right? And also be a little more open to understanding the way we look at society, that the same reasons we accept certain bodies, it's very easy to find reasons to also accept different bodies. So I think the message here is to learn and also to ask questions, right? Of course, you're going to be kind when asking questions, but if you're dealing with something different, the first step is to open your eyes to that difference. And then you can come to an understanding and to an acceptance and equality too.
And I would add, just read books by transgender authors so that you can open your eyes.
Exactly, yeah. And I have to add that Amara Moira's book is also available in Spanish. It has been published in Argentina for those who read Spanish.
I'll put links in the description. Professor Namorato, thank you so much for being here for this lovely conversation. And I hope we've learned a lot today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here.
This was an episode of NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw, recorded in the Radio Campus studio. Franek Wójcicki edited this episode, and the cover art is by Weronika Rosik. Please check out our show notes if you're interested in the books and other sources mentioned in this episode. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions for topics we could cover, email us. My name is Maria Usakowska. Thanks for listening.